Richard Thompson stepped into Miller's diner on a bright Tuesday morning, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air. At 65, Richard walked with the straight-backed posture that spoke of his 30 years in the military. Deep lines etched his face, each telling stories of battles fought both abroad and at home. He removed his cap briefly, the red one with bold letters supporting the current president, and smoothed his thinning, grey hair before putting it back on. This small-town diner had been his sanctuary for decades. He and Mary used to come every Tuesday, sitting in the same corner booth by the window. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," called Tom, the owner, from behind the counter. Several regulars nodded in his direction as Richard made his way to his usual spot. The diner buzzed with morning chatter. Farmers discussing the weather forecast. Teachers grabbing coffee before heading to the local school. The usual mix of folks from both sides of the tracks that made up Millfield. Richard settled into the booth, his joints protesting slightly. Since Mary's passing last year, these Tuesday visits had become both painful and necessary, a ritual he couldn't bear to break. He unfolded the paper menu even though he knew it by heart. Emma Williams approached his table, coffee pot in hand. She was new, college-aged, with tired eyes that suggested late nights of studying. Her grandfather had worked at the same factory as Richard before it closed down last year, putting 200 people out of work. "Coffee, sir?" she asked automatically before looking up. When she did look up, her eyes fixed on his cap. Her friendly expression vanished instantly. The coffee pot trembled slightly in her hand. "People like you don't belong here," she said, her voice loud enough to carry across the diner. The chatter stopped. Forks paused midway to mouths. All eyes turned toward their corner of the room. Richard didn't respond immediately. His weathered hands, spotted with age and marked with old scars, remained folded calmly on the table. He'd heard worse in his lifetime. Much worse. In the uncomfortable silence, he studied the young woman's face. Behind her anger, he recognized something familiar. Pain, fear, uncertainty. Those emotions had been Mary's constant companions during her final months. Richard had learned to look past the sharp words that sometimes came with suffering. "I'm sorry you feel that way," he finally said, his voice gentle and steady. "But I've been coming to this diner every Tuesday for 35 years. Emma's cheeks flushed red. She gripped the coffee pot tighter. "Well, things change. This town has suffered enough because of people supporting policies that hurt working families like mine." A man at the counter started to rise, his face darkening with anger, but Richard caught his eye and gave a small shake of his head. "Young lady," Richard said, "would you do an old man a favor? Would you sit with me for just 5 minutes? After that, if you still want me to leave, I will." Emma looked around nervously. Tom had emerged from the kitchen, concern written across his face. "It's your job or my breakfast," Richard added quietly, "and I'd hate for either of us to lose something important today." Emma hesitated, then placed the coffee pot on the table and slid into the seat across from him. Her posture remained rigid, defensive. Richard reached for his worn leather wallet and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the table to her. "That's Mary," he said softly. "My wife of 43 years. We sat at this exact table every Tuesday, morning from the day this diner opened. She ordered blueberry pancakes with extra butter, never syrup. Said it masked the taste of the berries." Emma glanced at the photo of the smiling woman with kind eyes. "She passed last spring," Richard continued. "Cancer. Fought for 18 months before it took her. Some battles can't be won, no matter how hard you fight." Emma's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said automatically. "Loss comes in many forms," Richard replied. "I lost my wife. You lost something too, didn't you? Something that made you angry enough to speak to a stranger the way you just did." Emma's eyes welled with tears. "My dad," she whispered. "He worked at the factory for 20 years. When it closed, She stopped, unable to continue. Richard nodded. "I know about the factory. I worked there too, before my military days. This town has seen hard times before. We've weathered them by sticking together, not by turning on each other." He tapped his cap. "This doesn't define me, just like whatever beliefs you hold don't fully define you. We're more than our politics, Emma. We're human beings first. A tear slipped down Emma's cheek. Dad hasn't been able to find work in over a year. I'm working double shifts here to help with bills and still trying to finish my nursing degree. Richard nodded. That takes courage. Mary was a nurse. Toughest person I ever knew. The tension in the diner began to ease as customers returned to their conversations, seeing that the confrontation had transformed into something quieter, more personal. I don't agree with your politics, Emma said, wiping her eyes. I probably never will. That's your right, Richard replied with a small smile. I fought for that right, and for mine to disagree with you, but we can disagree without making each other enemies. He reached across the table, his weathered hand open. Now how about that coffee? And maybe you could tell an old man about nursing school while I have my usual eggs and toast. Emma's hand met his in a brief, uncertain handshake. I'm sorry for what I said. Already forgotten, Richard answered. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is sit down and listen to someone we think we won't like. You've been brave today, Emma. Mary would have appreciated that. Richard Thompson's past ran deeper than most people in Millfield knew. For 30 years he had worn his country's uniform with pride, serving in conflicts that had taken him far from the quiet streets of his hometown. He'd seen humanity at its worst and its best, learning lessons about courage and compassion that couldn't be taught in classrooms. After retiring from military service, Richard had returned to Millfield and thrown himself into community work. He volunteered at the Veterans Center every Thursday, taught weekend woodworking classes at the community college, and quietly shoveled the driveways of elderly neighbors each winter without being asked. But his anchor through all those years had been Mary. They had met when he was home on leave, her bright laugh catching his attention across a crowded dance hall. You look like a man who's seen too much of the world, she'd told him that night. Maybe it's time someone showed you what's worth coming home for. For 43 years, she had been his compass. Their Tuesday morning breakfast at Miller's diner became sacred tradition. She with her blueberry pancakes, he with his eggs and toast. They would sit for hours discussing everything from town politics to their dreams for the garden. When the cancer came, it moved swiftly. Mary faced it with the same quiet strength she'd shown throughout their marriage. Don't you dare stop coming to Miller's on Tuesdays when I'm gone, she had made him promise in those final days. Some traditions shouldn't die with people. So he came week after week, sitting in their booth by the window. The emptiness across the table sometimes felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. He would order for 2 out of habit, then quietly ask Tom to box up Mary's pancakes for the neighbors' children. The regulars at Miller's noticed how Richard's shoulders had stooped since Mary's passing, how his eyes, once bright with stories, now seemed to be looking at something far away. But they also noticed how he still remembered to ask about Bill's grandson in college, or how Jenny's garden was growing, or whether the Thompson boy had recovered from his broken arm. He leaves the biggest tips, Tom often told new waitstaff. Even when his coffee gets cold because we're busy. Good man down to his bones, that Richard. Across town, in a small apartment above the laundromat, Emma Williams sat at her kitchen, table surrounded by textbooks and bills. The nursing program demanded more hours than she had, but she was determined. Her mother had been a nurse before arthritis forced early retirement. Now it fell to Emma to keep the family afloat. Dad, you need to eat something, she called to the figure slumped in front of the television. Robert Williams barely nodded. Since the factory closure, he seemed to have shrunk inside himself. 30 years at the assembly line, working his way up to floor manager, all erased with a corporate decision made thousands of miles away. The severance package had run out months ago. His job applications went unanswered. I'm heading to work, Emma said, gathering her textbooks. There's sandwich, stuff in the fridge. Her father nodded again. Be safe, he murmured, the words almost automatic. Emma's double shifts at the diner left her exhausted, but they paid the bills that kept piling up. Electric, water, her mother's medications, the nursing school tuition installments. Her younger brother Jack helped when he could with his part-time job at the gas station, but it never seemed enough. She tried not to feel bitter when customers at the diner complained about trivial things. Coffee not hot enough, toast too brown. But lately, as her father's depression deepened and her mother's health declined, That bitterness had grown harder to contain, especially when she served customers who supported policies she believed had destroyed her family's livelihood. People who voted for closing factories and moving jobs overseas. People who seemed oblivious to the struggles of families like hers. People like the old man in the red cap. "You seem distracted today," her co-worker Lucy commented as they refilled condiment bottles before the morning rush. "Dad had another rejection letter yesterday," Emma replied, squeezing ketchup with more force than necessary. "That's 26 applications now." Lucy squeezed her arm sympathetically. "Something will turn up." "That's what everyone says," Emma snapped, then immediately regretted her tone. "Sorry, just tired." "No worries," Lucy said. "Just try not to bite any customers' heads off today, okay? Tom noticed you were a bit sharp with the Peterson family yesterday." Emma nodded, embarrassed. She needed this job. She couldn't afford to lose it, because she couldn't control her emotions. But when she saw Richard Thompson walk in with that red cap, something inside her simply snapped. All the frustration, all the worry, all the nights staying up calculating how to stretch pennies. It all came pouring out in those 8 words she couldn't take back. "People like you don't belong here." She hadn't expected his calm response, hadn't expected him to share his story of loss, hadn't expected to find herself sitting across from him, seeing not a political symbol, but a grieving husband trying to honor a promise to his wife. By the time she poured his coffee, something had shifted in Emma's heart. Not her politics. Those remained firmly rooted in her family's experiences, but perhaps her understanding that behind every symbol, behind every vote, there were human beings with their own stories of pain and love and loss. "More coffee, Mr. Thompson?" she asked later, her voice gentle now. "Richard, please," he answered with a small smile. "And yes, thank you, Emma." Emma stood frozen, coffee pot in hand, as the diner fell silent around her. She had expected anger from Richard after her outburst. She had expected him to argue or leave or demand to speak with her manager. What she hadn't expected was his calm invitation. "Would you please sit with me for just 5 minutes?" Richard asked, his voice gentle, almost fragile. Emma felt every eye in the diner upon her. Tom was already moving from behind the counter, likely coming to fire her on the spot. Her heart pounded as panic set in. This job was everything, the only thing keeping her family's lights on and her mother's prescriptions filled. She began, searching for words. "Just 5 minutes," Richard repeated, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. "Then I'll go if you still want me to." Tom reached them, his face tight with concern. "Everything okay here?" Before Emma could respond, Richard looked up with a small smile. "Just fine, Tom. Emma's agreed to join me for coffee. I'd appreciate it if you'd give us a moment." Tom looked between them, confusion clear on his face, but he nodded slowly and retreated. With trembling legs, Emma slid into the booth across from Richard. She placed the coffee pot on the table, noticing how her hands shook. "I shouldn't have said that to you," she mumbled, unable to meet his eyes. "I could lose my job." "I won't let that happen," Richard assured her, "but I would like to understand why you said it." Emma looked up then, expecting to find judgment or condescension in his eyes. Instead, she saw only genuine curiosity and something deeper, a sadness that seemed to have nothing to do with her words and everything to do with the empty seat beside him. Richard reached into the pocket of his worn flannel shirt and pulled out a small leather wallet. From it, he extracted a photograph, its edges soft and frayed from countless handlings. He placed it gently on the table between them. "This is Mary," he said softly. Emma looked down at the image of a woman with a wide smile and bright eyes, standing in front of this very diner. She was holding onto Richard's arm, her head tilted toward his shoulder in a gesture of easy intimacy. Both looked much younger, but the diner's sign was clearly visible in the background. "Your wife?" Emma asked. Richard nodded, his weathered finger tracing the outline of Mary's face. "My wife for 43 years. We met when I was home on leave from the service. I was 22 and thought I knew everything about the world." A small smile touched his lips. "Mary showed me how little I actually knew." Emma found herself leaning forward slightly. "She's beautiful." "She was," Richard agreed. inside, and out, smart as a whip too. Never let me get away with lazy thinking. Always pushed me to see other perspectives even when I was sure I was right. He tapped the photograph. This was taken on the day this diner opened, 35 years ago. We came every Tuesday morning after that. It was our tradition. Understanding washed over Emma. And now you come alone. Richard's eyes grew misty. Cancer took her last spring. The doctors gave her 6 months. She fought for 18. I'm so... Sorry? Emma whispered, genuine remorse flooding through her. Not just for her harsh words earlier, but for the profound loneliness this man must feel, returning week after week to a place filled with memories. This booth, Richard continued, running his hand along the worn red vinyl. This exact spot was where we sat every week, where we talked about everything, our hopes, our fears, our disagreements. He looked up, meeting Emma's eyes directly. Mary and I didn't always vote the same way, you know. We had some mighty spirited debates right here at this table. Emma blinked in surprise. But you stayed together? For 43 years, Richard nodded. Because we learned to listen to each other. To respect that we each had reasons for believing what we believed. His hand trembled slightly as he returned the photograph to his wallet. I fought for 30 years in the service of this country, he said, his voice growing more emotional. I fought for your right to tell me I don't belong here. I respect that right. He paused, collecting himself. But I also believe we're stronger when we listen to each other's stories. The simplicity and sincerity of his words struck Emma like a physical blow. Tears welled in her eyes as shame washed over her. In her anger and frustration, she had reduced this man to nothing more than the political symbol on his cap. She had missed the human being beneath it, the grieving husband trying to honor a promise to his wife. My father lost his job when the factory closed, she found herself saying. He's been unemployed for over a year now. I'm working double shifts here while trying to finish nursing school. My mom needs expensive medication. The words tumbled out, releasing months of pent-up fear and resentment. I see that cap and I see the policies that I believe hurt my family. Richard listened intently, nodding occasionally. When she finished, he reached across the table and briefly covered her hand with his. Your pain is real, he said. Your struggles are real, and I'm truly sorry for what your family is going through. You don't have to be sorry, Emma said. It's not your fault. No, Richard agreed, but I can still care. We can disagree about solutions while still acknowledging each other's pain. Emma wiped at her eyes with her apron. Around them, the diner had resumed its normal breakfast bustle, though several customers still cast curious glances their way. Would you like to hear about Mary? Richard asked after a moment. She was a nurse too. Emma looked up, surprised. Really? Richard nodded, a genuine smile warming his face for the first time. 40 years at County General, she would have had plenty of advice for you about nursing school, that's for sure. Despite herself, Emma smiled back. I'd like that, she said softly. I'd like to hear about her. As Richard began to speak about his beloved Mary, Emma realized that something fundamental had shifted inside her. The man in the red cap was no longer an enemy or a symbol. He was Richard, a grieving husband, a veteran, a human being with his own story of love and loss, and she was finally ready to listen. Emma felt the weight of Richard's kindness as she sat across from him in the diner booth. His story about Mary had opened something inside her, a door she'd kept firmly shut against people whose political views differed from hers. The red cap that had triggered her anger now seemed less important than the human being wearing it. My dad worked at Harrison Manufacturing for 30 years, Emma said softly, fiddling with her apron. Started on the assembly line right out of high school, worked his way up to floor manager. She paused, fighting back tears. Then one day they called everyone into the cafeteria and announced the factory was closing. Just like that. 30 years of loyalty ended with a 2-month severance package. Richard listened intently, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. Dad hasn't been the same since, Emma continued. He just sits at home watching television, doesn't even look for work anymore after so many rejections. Mom's arthritis is getting worse, and her medicine costs keep going up. She looked up, meeting Richard's eyes. I'm not trying to make excuses for how I spoke to you, it's just, When I see that cap, I see the policies I believe hurt my family. Richard nodded slowly. Pain makes things personal. I understand that. At the next table, an older man cleared his throat. Emma turned to see Mr. Peterson, a regular customer she'd served for years. My nephew worked at Harrison too, he said. Moved to Ohio for a new job. Hates every minute of it, but what choice did he have? From across the diner, another voice joined in. My daughter's company just hired 3 former Harrison workers. It was Mrs. Jenkins, a retired school teacher who came in every morning for tea and toast. They're retraining them for tech support roles. Not the same pay, but it's something. Emma was surprised to see how many people were listening, how many were nodding in understanding. An elderly couple seated nearby, the Wilsons, rose from their table and approached. Mind if we join you? Mr. Wilson asked. Richard gestured welcomingly to the empty spaces in the booth. Mrs. Wilson, a tiny woman with bright eyes and silver hair, slid in beside Emma. Her husband settled next to Richard. Couldn't help but overhear, Mrs. Wilson said. We've been coming to this diner for Saturday breakfast for 52 years. She patted her husband's hand. And we've voted differently in every single election for 50 years of marriage. Mr. Wilson chuckled. Elizabeth here is a stubborn woman. Never could convince her I was right about politics. And George here, Mrs. Wilson countered with a smile, is equally stubborn. But we learned early on that a difference in voting habits doesn't mean a difference in values. Emma looked between them in genuine surprise. How do you manage that? Everyone in my family thinks the same way. I can't. Imagine? Oh, we argue plenty, Mr. Wilson assured her, sometimes very loudly. He winked at his wife. But at the end of the day, we remember that we both want the same things. Safety for our family, opportunity for our grandchildren, a community where people look out for each other. We just disagree on how to get there. The conversation expanded as more customers joined in. Bill from the hardware store talked about how his business had struggled after the factory closure, but was slowly recovering. Jenny, a young mother of 3, shared her worries about affording college for her children. Frank, who owned the local bookshop, spoke about his immigrant parents and their belief in American opportunity. Richard quietly signaled to Tom, who approached the growing gathering. Coffee for everyone, please, Richard requested. On me. Tom raised his eyebrows but nodded, returning moments later with a fresh pot. As he refilled cups around the expanded table, he marveled at the scene before him. Just 20 minutes earlier, he'd been certain he would need to escort a customer out or fire his waitress. Now the same people were engaged in the most civil conversation about difficult topics he'd witnessed in years. Never seen anything like it, Tom muttered to Lucy as she helped distribute coffee cups. Emma found herself relaxing as the conversation flowed around her. These weren't abstract political opponents anymore. They were neighbors with faces and stories and struggles not so different from her own. Mr. Peterson had a son with diabetes who couldn't afford insulin. Mrs. Jenkins worried about her retirement savings. Even those wearing caps similar to Richard's spoke about legitimate fears and hopes she could understand, even when she disagreed with their conclusions. Richard caught her eye across the table and gave her a gentle smile as if to say, "See? We're all just people." You know, Emma said during a lull in the conversation, my nursing instructor always says the first rule of medicine is to listen to the patient. She says most people will tell you exactly what's wrong if you just give them the chance to speak. She looked around the table. I think maybe that applies to more than medicine. Richard nodded approvingly. Mary used to say something similar. Said a good nurse knows that healing starts with being heard. Tom approached the table again, looking slightly concerned. Folks, I hate to break this up, but we've got the lunch crowd coming in soon. Richard checked his watch, surprised to see that nearly 2 hours had passed. Of course, Tom, sorry to take up so much space. He reached for his wallet. Your money's no good today, Tom said firmly, placing a hand on Richard's shoulder. What happened here this morning? Well, it's the best thing I've seen in my diner in a long time. As people began to gather their things, Mrs. Wilson leaned over to Emma. You know, dear, we have a community group that meets at the library on Thursday evenings. People from all walks of life discussing local issues. trying to find common ground. You might find it helpful for your family's situation and for your heart. Emma nodded, genuinely touched. I might just do that. As the impromptu gathering dispersed, Emma felt lighter somehow. The problems hadn't disappeared. Her father was still unemployed, the bills still needed paying, and her political convictions remained unchanged. But something had shifted in how she saw the people around her. Behind every political symbol was a human being with their own story of struggle and hope. The diner was buzzing with life, the smell of fresh coffee and pancakes filling the air. Emma moved swiftly between tables, balancing plates and refilling mugs. The sign by the door now read, "Coffee and conversation, all are welcome." A new tradition that had started just a week ago. Every Wednesday morning, people from the community gathered here to share their stories, their thoughts, and most importantly, to listen to one another. Richard sat at his usual corner table, scribbling notes in a small notebook. He looked up as Emma approached with a plate of eggs and toast. "Your usual," she said with a grin, setting it down in front of him. "Thanks, Emma," he replied, closing his notebook. "You know, I think this place has more heart now than it's ever had." Emma chuckled. "It's because of the people," she said. "The stories, the laughter. It's changed everything." Richard nodded. Over the past week, he and Emma had developed an unexpected friendship. Their conversations had started cautiously, but they quickly discovered they had more in common than they thought. Now he was helping her apply for scholarships, and she had introduced him to her family. Every Sunday he joined them for dinner, something he never imagined himself doing. The bell over the door jingled as a new customer entered. A man in his 40s, dressed in a suit, looked around before finding an empty table near the window. Emma greeted him warmly and handed him a menu. As the man sat, he glanced at the diverse group of people in the diner, young and old, from all walks of life, and frowned. "Looks like a lot of different kinds of people here," he said with a tone that hinted at disapproval. Emma paused, her heart beating a little faster, but she kept her voice steady. "That's right," she said gently. "In this diner, everyone belongs." The man raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Emma smiled, her kindness unwavering. "Would you like to join us? You can share your story too." The man hesitated, looking around the room. Richard, watching from his table, gave Emma a small nod of encouragement. Slowly the man stood and approached a group sitting near the center. They shifted to make space for him, their expressions welcoming. As Emma returned to her work, she caught Richard's eye. He smiled, a quiet look of pride on his face. The camera of life, if there had been one, would have panned to capture the scene. Strangers talking, laughing, and finding common ground at tables once meant only for meals. Sometimes healing started with something as simple as being willing to listen.